China and the U.S. are moving closer to a trade war. Many policymakers in the U.S. Capitol today say carrots are useless when it comes to dealing with China. Republicans and Democrats now are wielding sticks. China's activities in the U.S. are worrying many American policymakers, who believe that Chinese investments are giving Beijing a strategic foreign policy advantage. This tension could lead to more overt, widespread hostilities on the economic front. U.S. President Donald Trump's mantra before and since his tour of Asia earlier this month touted the need for countries to accept each other's unique characteristics to ensure prosperity for the world's great civilizations. The message of harmony might have offset discord caused by Trump's harsh criticism of multilateral trade and investment deals during the trip. When it comes to civilization, however, the course in Washington appears set for a clash rather than cooperation and mutual respect. Amid a push by lawmakers to apply greater scrutiny to Chinese investments in the U.S., multiple investigations launched by Trump's administration targeting China threatened to destabilize Sino-U.S. close economic and cultural ties, which have underpinned prosperity for the Asia-Pacific region for decades, trade officials and analysts interviewed by the South China Morning Post said. At one time, a Washington consensus had assumed closer economic integration with China would encourage Beijing to open its markets and provide greater opportunities for foreign companies. That agreement has now changed. Many policymakers in the U.S. Capitol today say carrots are useless when it comes to dealing with China. Republicans and Democrats now are wielding sticks. But He Fei, China's former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, said U.S. lawmakers should listen to all segments of the American people, not just the Defense Department. We understand there are some strategic concerns about China, but we should not be hijacked by this extreme thinking, he said. The former diplomat was referring to a recently declassified U.S. Defense Department study that mobilized lawmakers on both sides of the aisle with its assertion that China's investment activity in the U.S. will directly enable key means of foreign military advantage. Washington has been struggling for a long time about what is the best way to get China to adapt and change, what would work and what would also preserve the system, the global trading system that we have, Scott Kennedy, director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Washington-based think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, said. Trump is less risk-averse than all of his predecessors, Kennedy said. The logic of the president when negotiating with U.S. companies operating in China is that, single quote, yes, maybe you'll lose some sliver of that current piece of cake that you have access to, but if you want to expand the size of the cake then you might potentially have access to China or elsewhere, then you have to be willing to put this current slice at risk. China and the U.S. may be coming to a head over trade hostilities. AP. Images proposed changes to the way the U.S. government reviews foreign investment gained more urgency owing to the Defense Department study, a 49-page document called China's Technology Transfer Strategy, How Chinese Investments in Emerging Technology Enable a Strategic Competitor to Access the Crown Jewels of U.S. Innovation. The report, initially circulated among U.S. lawmakers a few weeks after Trump took office in late January, addressed the government's concerns about China at a very high level, even suggesting there was potential for a civilizational clash that Trump, in Asia, said countries could avoid if they played by mutually agreed-upon rules. The Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, co-authored by Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn, a Republican, and Dianne Feinstein, a senior Democrat, has brought support in Congress. If enacted, the legislation would expand foreign investment review procedures overseen by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which is chaired by the Treasury Secretary and seeks input from the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security. Significant changes to the CFIUS review process include giving it authority to review all non-passive investments by foreign entities and suspend pending transactions and impose new conditions, retroactively, on completed transactions. CFIUS now only reviews transactions in which a foreign party wants a controlling interest in a U.S. company and makes recommendations to the president on the national security threat posed by a proposed transaction. New requirements in the bill have the practical effect of subjecting many Chinese acquisitions to mandatory review, according to an analysis by U.S. law firm Struck & Lavin, which represents companies facing CFIUS reviews. The proposed Cornyn-Feinstein bill would constitute the most significant change in the last 10 years to U.S. review of foreign investment and merits close attention, especially in the current environment where there is an increasing degree of protectionist rhetoric, according to a memo by Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen and Katz, another law firm representing foreign companies investing in the U.S. While CFIUS is designed to halt the transfer to U.S. adversaries of advanced dual-use technologies, those that can be adapted for military use, lawmakers are calling for the process to cover transactions that would give Chinese companies control over large pools of personally identifiable data. Such data, analysts and other observers warn, could make government officials and active members of the U.S. military vulnerable to blackmail or offers to engage in espionage. The concern over access to data partly explains the delay in U.S. government approval for Ant Financial's $1.2 billion takeover of U.S. money transfer service MoneyGram. The buyer has been trying to secure the approval since April. Many analysts and policymakers have pointed out that MoneyGram would not be allowed, under China's laws, to acquire Ant Financial, further pushing the effort to crack down on Chinese investments in the U.S. We are not commenting on the CFIUS process, but we are continuing to work with the various regulatory agencies and remain focused on closing the transaction by the end of the year, Ant Financial said in September. The company is a financial affiliate of Alibaba Group, which also owns the South China Morning Post. Other threats to the U.S.-China economic relationship include an investigation under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974 into Chinese regulations that force U.S. companies operating in China to transfer technology and intellectual property rights to local business partners. The investigation could lead to unilateral U.S. trade remedy actions such as tariffs meant to compensate the U.S. for losses American companies have sustained from Beijing's trade regulations or a dispute settlement process within the World Trade Organization. The outstanding question is, after the investigation concludes, if there are adverse findings, how our government handles these findings, whether they go forward with consultations to resolve the problem, or go with a dispute settlement in the tow, or take unilateral actions like sanctions against China, said Anna Ashton, Director of Business Advisory Services at the Washington-based U.S.-China Business Council. If the government were to take unilateral actions, then there will be a risk that we will be out of compliance of our international obligations, she said. Then we will be starting a trade war, perhaps. The People's Republic of China flag and the U.S. Stars and Stripes fly along Pennsylvania Avenue near the U.S. Capitol in Washington. Reuters/Hyunguankang. In addition to CFIUS legislation and the Section 301 investigation, the U.S. Commerce Department since March has been looking into the impact on national security of imports of steel and aluminum, an initiative aimed at imports from China more than any other country. Commenting on these investigations in July, Trump said of China, "They're dumping steel and destroying our steel industry. They've been doing it for decades, and them stopping it. It'll stop. There are two ways, quotas and tariffs. Maybe I'll do both." Since Trump returned to Washington, there's been no official effort on the part of China to diffuse the concerns behind Cornyn and Feinstein's bill or the government investigations. "I don't think there are so many projects Chinese are investing in here related to national security," Li Bin, who heads the Economic Affairs section of China's embassy in Washington, said. In the past there were a few cases but not many. Recommendations by the U.S. Congress to strengthen the CFIUS examinations or assessments of Chinese investments, they are not very constructive. The Counselor for Economic Affairs urged Chinese enterprises and CFIUS to engage more often in discussions that would reveal more about the nature of a project and its intentions. "Communication is very important," Li said, adding that he is not aware of any effort so far to open such dialogue. Spokesman for the U.S. chapter of the China General Chamber of Commerce, which represents more than 1,500 mainland Chinese enterprises operating in the country, said they could not find any CGCC members to comment on possible changes to CFIUS or other potential trade action by the U.S. against China. "The Chinese don't want to be seen as directly lobbying on American legislation," CSIS's Scott Kennedy said. They also know that the course of legislation is never straightforward and that there is a vigorous debate within the United States. If they are seen as overly poking their fingers into this, they can get burned. Still, China has many options when it comes to retaliation, and analysts expect Beijing to use them. If there's trade tension, U.S. companies will face certain risks on a number of grounds, including anti-monopoly laws, anti-corruption laws and consumer protection laws, Sherman Chu, a Piper lawyer who advises companies undergoing CFIUS reviews, said. Authorities in China have more discretion over how they go about interpreting the rules than they do in the U.S. China's leaders have said that many international rules were set by other countries when China was weak and had little input. So it's not a surprise that China hasn't always been willing to live up to the spirit of these rules, Chu said. There's a risk of miscalculation resulting in a trade war, and the real question is whether the Trump and 11 administrations will be adroit enough to avoid it. Not all of Washington's China hands agree that it is in the U.S. interests to ratchet up trade action against Beijing. The impression I have is there are still unresolved disagreements within the Trump administration of how to deal with these bilateral trade friction questions, J. Stapleton Roy, U.S. ambassador to China under former Presidents George H. Bush and Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, said. Roy, who was born in China and raised there during the Second World War and the Communist Revolution, is founding director emeritus of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a Washington think tank. If we take unilateral actions against China, China will retaliate with unilateral actions against us, Roy said. Where's the net benefit? Who gains from that? Speaking at a lunch at the New York-based China Institute last week, Vice Minister He addressed the geostrategic concerns around China's new ranking among global powers. China wants to invest much more in the United States, but we've met quite strong political resistance, he said. I can't understand the strategic anxiety on the part of the U.S. about China's growth. We are ready to move from prosperity to become a powerful nation, one of the global powers. For the U.S. to feel anxious about China is understandable, but we should not let that anxiety take over, to become the sole guideline for foreign policy. U.S. President Donald Trump ponders trade war with China. Trump has ordered a review of Chinese trade practices that force foreign firms to partner with Chinese firms. This comes shortly after he praised Beijing for its support of harsher UN sanctions on North Korea. While U.S. President Donald Trump presses China to step up pressure against North Korea, he is considering sparking a trade war with the world's second-largest economy. On Monday, Trump plans to sign an executive order asking his trade office to investigate China for its alleged theft of American technology and intellectual property. The president, who was vacationing at his golf club in the state of New Jersey, said Friday that he planned to return to Washington on Monday for a very important meeting, and we're going to have a pretty big press conference. It was not immediately clear whether his trade dispute with Beijing would be the subject. The commissioned report may take a year to compile but could lead to U.S. sanctions against Beijing. Still, Trump praised China Friday for supporting the recent UN vote to ratchet up sanctions against North Korea. In a phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the two leaders reaffirmed their shared desire for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Trump, however, also informed Xi about the pending probe into China's trade practices, according to two U.S. officials with knowledge of the conversation. They spoke on condition of anonymity as they were not authorized to discuss the private call. The Trump administration suspects China of appropriating U.S. know-how access to China in particular. Trump wants an examination of Chinese trade practices that force American companies to share their intellectual property if they want access to the world's second-largest economy. U.S. businesses are often forced to create joint ventures with a Chinese partner and turn over valuable technology assets, a practice the White House claims stymies U.S. economic growth. The latest review will be conducted by the U.S. Trade Representative under the Trade Act of 1974. Depending on the results, the U.S. could either seek remedies through the World Trade Organization or outside of it. China under U.S. scrutiny. China also funds and facilitates the acquisition of U.S. firms that possess advanced technologies, U.S. officials said. They added, if Americans continue to have their best technologies and intellectual property stolen or forcibly transferred offshore, the United States will find it difficult to maintain its current technology leadership position. Chinese commercial policy aimed to acquire and absorb the intellectual property of the United States and other countries around the world, according to the officials. China's Foreign and Commerce ministries did not immediately respond to requests for comment Sunday. The Trump administration is already investigating Chinese commercial practices on several fronts, notably whether steel and aluminum imports were jeopardizing national security. On Tuesday, Washington announced preliminary sanctions against imports of Chinese aluminum foil. Big/TJ, AP, AF.